Okay, here we go with Unit 1 of the material that you need for the New York State U.S. History Regents exam. If you have not already looked at what I'm calling Unit 0, the introduction and the preliminary material, those two videos, you really should look at those first because they will be very helpful to you in understanding how this exam works and what you need to do in it, and therefore what you're going to need to know. I'm going to start now with the, if you like, historical content of the exam. So you should have a sense of the kind of skills you need. Most importantly on this exam, you are going to have to contextualize. That means you are going to have to look at a document and figure out what is the historical context. What is this document talking about? What's the time period? What's the event? It's not necessarily going to be immediately obvious from the document. You have to bring your outside knowledge to say, aha, that refers to the New England colonies or something like this. You're also going to have to be able to evaluate the information in that document. So the more you know of background, the more you can bring to bear as you read them. As I pointed out to you in previous items, you should have access, if you're watching this video, also to the document called Review Notes, U.S. History Regents. That is a one-note document, one-note notebook. So you should actually have access to two items. A one-note notebook that gives you an outline of the curriculum. That is from the state of New York, and what a sort of broad outline of what you're expected to know. It's not very detailed. I've taken that and created a second document, this Review Notes in U.S. History. We're going to go through this, and as we go, I'm going to add to that original outline some detail to help you. You should create your own one-note notebook in which you cut and paste the material from the review notes, put it in there, and then as you study or even as you're listening to these videos, you add your own notes. All of you have different strengths and weaknesses. All of you remember different things. So if you know that you've got a spot, oh, I better make a note about that because I'll forget it, you add it to your own. The end of it, therefore, ideally, you should have at least links or copies of 3 notebooks. The outline from the state, the much more detailed, annotated review notes, and then your own, where you've taken the review notes and added your own notes. As you know, there is a great deal to know. There is no way I can review absolutely every fact. All I can do is give you a sort of broad set of outlines. It's going to be oversimplified. It's going to leave things out, but hopefully provide you with enough context that it will be helpful to you as you study. If there is anything in these reviews that you look at and say, I don't remember this at all, I never heard of this, then you know there's something you need to flag and go back to your main textbook or to the blue brief review paperback book that you should have to review that material and look at it in some more detail. Okay. So Unit 1 or Period 1 that we begin with is Colonial Foundations. You see there the dates, 1607 to 1763. All of the dates for these periods mean something. 1607 you should recognize as the beginnings of English colonization in North America. Specifically, that's the year that Jamestown gets founded in Virginia. 1763 you should recognize as the end of the French and Indian War, when the English colonies are kind of firmly settled. The English are no longer directly competing with anybody else in their colonies, and we begin the march in 1763 toward the American Revolution. That becomes the focus. So let's take a look at a few things here, and I'm going to move this over a bit. Okay, Colonial Foundations. European colonization in North America prompted cultural contact and exchange between diverse peoples. Cultural differences and misunderstandings at times led to conflict. A variety of factors contributed to the development of regional differences, including social and racial hierarchies in colonial America. So that's the big picture. We'll go into detail now. I'm pointing out key ideas that you should understand before we even get started. Always remember, geography drives culture. Geography includes land, soil, and climate. That is the land formations, harbors, and mountains and that. Soil, how rich is the soil and what kind of crops can you grow in it. And climate, do you have long winters or short winters, a long growing season? Is it generally warm, generally cold, and like that? Native Americans adapted to the geography around them. By the way, as did the colonists, as we'll see. So, for instance, Eastern Woodland Indians. Those are the various tribes, and there were many of them, that lived in the New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania area, the northeast of the United States. They tended, for instance, to live in longhouses, engaged in some agriculture and some hunting, so were semi-settled in villages and regions, with men off hunting and women left to run the farming. Women became key powerful figures along with men in many tribes. So what do I mean? Well, if we just take a look at this for a second. This, for instance, is a longhouse. Move this over a bit. This is what the Native Americans lived in this area that we are in. The Lenni Lenape were the Indians that happened to live around the Staten Island area. They spoke the Algonquin language. And it may not seem this way. It may be hard for you to realize. But first of all, you have these sticks here. Wood was used as your fuel source. And then the longhouse was often made from a combination of skins and bark, which is what kept it dry in rainy season and kept it warm in winter. This is a pretty permanent thing you see here, right? This is there to stay. These were not nomadic people. They tended to form a village, farm around it. If you're farming, you can't move much because you got to wait for things to grow and weed the crops and all that. They were, I say, semi-settled because they tended to be a little seasonal. So they would come back to an area in summer and they might move, say, farther inland during the winter or deeper into the woods, something like this. But they stayed in the same region. They also ate meat. Well, that meant the men had to go out hunting, and sometimes they were out for many days, chasing down deer and what have you. The women would stay back and do the farming. But because they were dependent on that farming for food, the women were important and played a key role, and they were not going to be pushed around. So they wanted to have a say in the tribe, too. So in the Northeast, it was not uncommon that women had a role of some prominence in decision-making in the tribe, that the tribes tended to be settled in an area, sometimes a village, at least in a region, and that they engaged in both farming and hunting. Let me point out the kind of farming they did for a moment. This is the so-called Three Sisters farming. Three sister crops, and it was brilliantly clever. Corn, you have here, right? Growing up on a stalk. Beans are these vines. The bean vines can't grow on the ground. They need something to twirl around, to climb around, and cling to properly grow. So if you have corn and you also plant beans, the beans will use the corn stalk and they'll grow too. Squash down here, which includes things like pumpkins and that sort of stuff, grows on a vine, but the vine runs along the ground with these big sort of shady leaves. and it shades the soil, keeps the moisture in, and a lot of the bugs and the weeds out. So the trick of this is that, and they didn't know the science of this, of course. They didn't know the chemistry or anything like that. But they knew if you grew corn alone, or beans alone, or squash alone, it was okay, but it wasn't that easy. If you grew them together, the corn grew up, the beans used the corn to grow better, the squash protected the ground and made the corn and the beans grow better. And what they didn't know, because they didn't know anything about chemistry, but they observed, they all grow better together. Each plant takes certain nutrients out of the soil and pumps others in. Well, these plants are complementary. What corn pulls out of the soil, beans and squash push into it, and vice versa. So they actually help each other grow, and it keeps the soil fairly fertile for longer. The Three Sisters farming was figured out by trial and error, but modern science can figure out why it works so well. What they also didn't know, but again, trial and error, is these three food crops complement each other in the human body. Beans are a high protein source. Squash and corn give you carbs, but also certain kinds of sugars, and there's even some protein in there. So if you tried to live on any one of them alone, if you just ate nothing but corn, over time, actually, it's not good for you. It creates nutritional deficiencies and can make you pretty sick. But if you eat corn and squash and beans as sort of the basis of your diet, they help you quite a bit. Some of you may be familiar with rice and beans. Rice has some types of protein in it, some types of amino acid. Beans have others. And if you put them together, you get a complete protein. Again, the Indians wouldn't have known the chemistry of this, but they observed that people were healthier with all of these. So the Native Americans of the Northeast and all of the other Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere had adopted different versions of this depending on their region. This begins, as I point out in the notes, I'll remind you later, in Central America. The Mayan people down in Central America figure out how to do this, and it soon quickly spreads. Let me point out a couple of other items here. So this is a map of the New York area. There's Staten Island down there, New York City. The sort of salmony pink color here is the Algonquin Indians. So all these individual tribes, the Delaware, the Wappingers, the Montaukes, the Mohicans, they all spoke some version of the Algonquin language. Over here, the purpley end is the Iroquois peoples, and that was a separate language. I point these out to you because this is upstate New York. Yes, this is Staten Island. The Lenni Lenape, who were the people here, were Delaware Indians, the Algonquin people. But if you go upstate, you had these tribes, the Wenro, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. Worth knowing because they formed together as tribes a thing called the Iroquois Confederacy. Something you should know. Iroquois Confederacy was a treaty organization among these originally 5 tribes and eventually 6. 6 joined it. That was an early form of representative democracy. This is completely independent of the Europeans. The Europeans don't give them this. They figure this out themselves. And the Iroquois Confederacy has a kind of constitution that much, much later on, Benjamin Franklin would study a bit and say, boy, there's some good ideas here for how to run a country. It's a little bit of a stretch to say the American government is based on the Iroquois Confederacy. But several of the colonists, including Adams and Franklin, were aware of it and seemed to admire it. I just point out to you, too, this is an item, I don't know, sometimes this shows up on exams. This is a wampum belt. Europeans thought wampum was Indian for money. It's not exactly. That's a kind of European notion. But they did weave these things. So it's perhaps a little hard for you to see here, but this is made up of hundreds of little tiny bits, beads, made from shell, different colored shells. So it's a bit like pixels on your screen, right? And you put them together, or a mosaic. You put them together in these rows, and you get these patterns. This was one of the original wampum belts that was woven, made to commemorate, if you like, the Iroquois Confederacy. Each of these represents one of the tribes that was joined together in it. And it's become a symbol of the Native Americans of New York State ever since. You still see this sort of the purple and the 5 or then sometimes 6 blocks here to represent the tribes. The 6 nations, just point out to you 2. These are the Mohawk, the Tuscarora, the Oneida, Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. The Tuscarora are also called the Wendo. Similar culture. They spoke similar languages, different dialects, but their own sort of take on each of it. So once again, I just pointed out to you to know, what should you take away from this? Native Americans were not dumb. They were not unsophisticated. They had politics that were as complicated as the Europeans. They had their own rivalries, and they were not a singular group. There's no such thing as just American Indian. Just like you can't exactly say European. We see big differences between Northern Italians and Southern Italians and Sicilians, and between the Swiss and the Germans and the French. Well, there were as much diversity among them as well. Okay. That's to be contrasted, for instance, with the Indians of the Great Plains, who were nomadic hunters, chasing buffalo as their food source. They lived in those teepees, we remember, yeah? And the teepees are what? They're folding tents. They were easy to move around from place to place because you had to be nomadic. In that kind of a world, their society was male-dominated. It was the men who did the hunting. So, what's the takeaway? Well, geography, the fact that in the eastern woodlands you could do the farming, and your food sources were farming and some local hunting of like deer, and in the Great Plains you didn't have much farming, but you had to chase the buffalo for all of the products that you needed for your tribe. That also affected gender roles for men and women. It affected how they organized their tribal governments. We see, yeah, how much influence this can have. So we talked about the Three Sister Farming and the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, let's talk about something else. Also need to know, whenever we talk about the colonies, as we're about to, all colonies are ultimately businesses. The Europeans often brought Christianity to the New World as a kind of side effect, or they were trying to start their own communities for religious or political outcasts. That's true, but a colony was always there to function as a business. This is the age, after all, of mercantilism or mercantilism. You can pronounce it either way. Colonies, the idea in mercantilism or mercantilism, colonies send raw materials from the colony back to mother country, and they buy all their needs from mother country. So colonies are there to provide raw materials to and markets for mother country. So when you think of colonies, always think of the American colonies, the English colonies. Every one of them is looked at as a business. Okay, next item here. Contact between Native American groups and Europeans occurred through cultural exchanges, resistance efforts, and conflict. I'm going to note for you here, I'll put in, I should, BAMO. Note the Columbian Exchange. So the Columbian Exchange, just remind you, is this business. Once Christopher Columbus alerts Europe to the fact that there is a North and South America out there, once they begin to figure that out, there is this flow of new goods back and forth across the Atlantic. We call this the Columbian Exchange. Europe comes to America and discovers here, having never had it before, tobacco, quinine. Quinine is a plant that produces a kind of juice that you can use to treat malaria. Yeah. Sweet potatoes, avocados, peppers, peanuts, groundnuts, potatoes. Potatoes, we think of potatoes like being Irish or potatoes are big in Eastern Europe, right? Potatoes are from Peru, unknown in Europe before this. Same thing with the tomato. Nobody in Italy was making the sauce until the explorers came back with tomatoes from Peru, and Europe started to figure out what to do with it. Corn, most beans, vanilla, pineapple, turkey is completely native to North America. Pumpkins, which is really kind of squash, and cacao, which becomes, of course, chocolate eventually. On the other hand, a lot of things we think of as American are not. Coffee. A lot of people think coffee is South American. It's not. It's actually from Arabia over here. And the Europeans figure out there are spots in South America that are great to grow it, and that's how it becomes an industry here. Bananas are also not from Central and South America. They are brought over by Europeans from Africa. Citrus fruits, lemons and oranges and things. Again, we think of it as like having been born in Florida. No, oranges are brought over by Europeans. Honeybees are unknown here. Cattle are unknown here. They didn't put on this particular picture. Oh, here we go. Horse. Native Americans did not know what a horse was. There were no horses until Europeans brought them over. Think about the change that made to Native American life. Suddenly all the tribes in the West become dependent on the horse as their means of transportation and hunting. Also, very important, Europeans brought a lot of diseases with them. Smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough. You guys may not have never run into whooping cough. There's pertussis it's called, and we have a vaccine for it now. Malaria. Those are all brought from Europe to the Americas. What's the effect? Well, some of it is that Native Americans now have cattle and have beef for the first time. They have horses, again, which provides them with transportation. However, 90% of Native Americans, when Columbus arrives, within about 100 years of him showing up, 90% of the population of the Americas was wiped out. Because the natives, having never encountered smallpox in particular and influenza and measles, they had no natural immunity. Nobody in the tribe had anything in their DNA to protect them. And so it just ran rampant and killed them in massive, massive numbers. But this is the Columbian Exchange. Okay, now we're back over here. If I can pull this in a bit. Bammo. Let me just do this here. Can I do this? Hang on. Okay, students will trace European contact with Native Americans, including the Dutch, English, the French, and the Spanish. So let's talk about it. First of all, never forget, it's largely about sugar. The most expensive or most lucrative, most profitable product that you could get out of the Americas was sugar. Even a small island in the Caribbean produced so much sugar that France, eventually, at the end of the French and Indian War, was willing to give up all of Canada just to hang on to that little tiny island. Sugarcane is not native to the Americas, but the Europeans brought it and found just the right growing conditions in the Caribbean. So everybody in Europe, the Dutch, the English, the French, the Spanish, all want islands in the Caribbean, no matter what else they get. Let's talk then about other things. The Spanish, of course, were the first Europeans here, beginning with Columbus. 1492, Columbus shows up, and in the 1490s and 1500s, they explore the Caribbean, Central America, South America. They're primarily interested in gold. They think that there's some hidden treasure of huge amounts of gold here that they never really find. But they start to take land and they create agricultural colonies, plantations, on a feudal system. It's owned by a Spanish lord. The conquistadors, the conquerors, own the land. The natives are slaves. Eventually, Catholic priests put pressure on the king to stop the slavery of natives. The Catholic priests, after all, were trying to bring the natives into Christianity, and so they weren't happy, actually, about the slave trade. The King of Spain kind of reluctantly ends enslaving Native Americans, but then they simply become serfs, if you remember that from Global, which is not really much better. You have this encomienda system, as it's called, a Spanish medieval-style feudal plantation with a lord and a bunch of serf natives who are tied to the land. Not technically as slaves, but pretty close. The goal of the Spanish is to own the land and control the natives. At best, the nicest of the Spanish want to turn the natives into little Spanish peasants, make them learn the Spanish language, convert to Christianity, and they treated them as kind of children who could never govern themselves. The worst of the Spanish, of course, treated them as little more than animals. Now, we contrast that for a moment with the French. The French focus on a few Caribbean islands, but they are more interested than the Spanish are in South and Central America. The French look at North America. They come down through what is now Canada and upstate New York and down the Mississippi River in the 1500s and 1600s. We'll look at a map of this in a few minutes. They explore the whole of what we call the Midwest now and the Canada region. What are they interested in? They're not really interested in big agricultural plantations. They're not looking to create little medieval serfdoms. They want to trade in fur. North America is full of animals, particularly beavers, who have great fur. The fur is waterproof, and the Europeans use it for all sorts of things, most notably making hats. And it's a damn good trade. It's expensive stuff. So the French, they want to get their hands on as much fur as possible in Canada and the Midwest and upstate New York, which is where these animals live. Instead of sending over a ton of guys, they send over a handful to create little trading posts, little forts here and there, and little towns, small villages, not big, heavily populated colonies. What they want is the Indians to do the hunting. Indians hunt anyway, so they say to the Indians, for every beaver skin you bring in, we will trade you. And what they traded mostly was metal, as in, metal. Native Americans, North American Indians, did not have much in the way of metal, iron, steel, any of that. So when the Europeans showed up with steel axes, steel knives, metal cooking utensils and pots and that sort of business, this was all news to the Indians and great stuff. So for a few axes and knives, which were very useful to them, they were willing to go out and trade a bunch of animal skins. So this is what they did. The French treated the Indians as trading partners. Indians did the hunting and sold the furs to the French. And the French tended, as opposed to the Spanish, who made the natives learn Spanish, the French tended to learn the Indian languages. After all, if you are treating a bunch of people as serfs on your land, right, they're not your equal. But if you're trying to make a business deal with an Indian, you have to kind of treat him. You may not think he's your equal or as civilized as you, but you have to sort of treat him that way to make a bargain, right? So the French are learning Indian tongues. French missionary priests, who also come over, learn the Iroquois and Mohawk languages. And instead of sort of forcing the Indians to become Christian, the French priests try to talk the Indians into being Christian. They try to convince them of Christianity and tell them the story of Christ and so on. The French still considered the Native Americans savages, but there's a much more equal relationship going on here. The French had a big chunk of property in the New World. Again, I'll show you a map in a couple of minutes. But they had far fewer settlers and less government, I should say, in the colonies than the Spanish did. The Dutch were sort of like the French. They were also all over the Caribbean, but they settled here in New Netherlands, as it was called, the New York, New Jersey region, specifically New Amsterdam, which was a tiny village and fort on the southern tip of Manhattan, and, yes, Staten Island, which is where we get the name from, Staten Island. It simply means States Island, and is named for the States General, the Dutch Parliament back home. The Dutch are doing this in the 1620s to about the 1660s, so they're a little bit later than, say, the Spanish. They're here to trade with the Indians as well. So New Amsterdam Colony here is a little settlement with a few farms, but it's meant really to be enough farms to sustain a little port city, to be the main trading post. They also establish Fort Orange, which we now call Albany, which is way the hell up at the top of the Hudson River, deep in upstate New York. So the Indians could trade with the Dutch up at Fort Orange. The Dutch would then sail down the Hudson with the goods to New Amsterdam, and then pack it up on big ships to take it over to Europe. The English, what are the English about? They are the latecomers. The last one's over here. England doesn't start seriously settling until 1607, and they really don't get off the ground till the late 1600s. 1607 is Jamestown in Virginia in the south. 1620 is Plymouth in Massachusetts in New England. Jamestown starts off as a hunt for gold, but soon they know there's no gold there, but it becomes all about tobacco, the key profitable cash crop that they discover here. Europe goes crazy for tobacco, and that's how they're going to make their money. Plymouth in New England is settled largely by religious outcasts. You guys probably know the stories of Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and all that. But never forget, even though the group of people that settled there are these religious folks, they're there because they have been hired as a group, as contractors for a joint stock company, trying to start a colony as a business in the New World. So the company looks at Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay Colony, the two of them combined, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony, to become what we call Massachusetts. They look at that as a business. The settlers up there say, well, we're doing this to start this little religious village, but they still have to make a living, so they're contractors for the company. Okay. And I'm zipping through it because I can't reteach the whole course, right? Next, students will examine the impacts of European colonization on Native Americans, who eventually lost much of their land and experienced a drastic decline in population through diseases and armed conflict. We've talked about this already a bit. The Spanish, let me show you the map, by the way. So this is just a quick look at some of the exploration that goes on. The minute Columbus gets back, there's Columbus, in 1492, 1493, and Europe starts to talk about this. You get this mad rush of explorers that come over trying to figure out what it is Columbus found. After all, Columbus comes over and he just bops around the Caribbean here a bit. So you get Vespucci, Amerigo Vespucci, and another Italian sailing for the Spanish, looking around. You get Avila's not that important. You get Verrazano, Giovanni de Verrazano, an Italian who's sailing for the French. He comes over and goes up the coast, and including finds New York Harbor, and actually parks his boat, you should remember, right under where the Verrazano Bridge is now. The best guess we can make as historians is that he probably parked his ship overnight over on the Brooklyn side, about where the Verrazano hits Brooklyn. And he may have sent his men, it's a little confusing when you read his diary, but he may have sent his men on to Staten Island itself to look for fresh water. You get Jacques Cartier, also sailing for French. Giovanni Gabotto, an Italian sailing for England. Henry Hudson comes over, a Dutch explorer. So these guys are all looking around here. Now, you wind up then with the Spanish creating this kind of Spanish empire here. The Spanish take what we call now Mexico and southern U.S., Florida, Central America, much of South America. The Portuguese are over more in what is now Brazil, and a bunch of these islands. But everybody's got a piece of the action here. Eventually, by the period we're talking about with the New England colonies, or the British colonies, Spain has got all of this: Mexico, Central America, and parts of South America, bits of the Caribbean, Florida. France has New France, which is this whole region here, most of what is the important part of Canada, and down the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi, so all of this. England claims this. They actually found, this is Hudson's Bay up here, there's not much happening up here, you know, this is some seals and ice is what this is. But New England and the Virginia colonies, this purple here, this is all the British colonies. New Netherland is this little sliver where the Dutch are settled. So we see everybody's got a piece of the action here. Okay. The Spanish, we said, conquer, capture, and enslave, or enserf, the natives. And the decline in population is the devastating effect of diseases. The French and the Dutch trade with the natives. They take land. The Dutch actually buy Manhattan, famously, but in the first real estate swindle of the Americas, the Dutch buy Manhattan from the wrong tribe. They arrive in Manhattan, they try to buy it from the Native Americans they see there. The Native Americans very happily take their axes and knives and wampum and whatever else they're trading. Why not, right? And then the tribe goes home to New Jersey because they were just visiting there for the day. That's a true story. But the Dutch and the French trade with the natives. They take land when helpful. It's not like they're all that nice to the natives, but they're less about conquest, so to speak. The English take land and mostly just push the natives out of the way, whereas the Spanish try to enslave them. The English don't really do that much. They're more interested in just moving them back, taking over, and setting up English farms. All of these folks treat the natives as nothing more than a problem. The French and the Dutch see them as a little bit of an opportunity to trade with. The English actually trade a little bit with the natives, but for the most part, they're kind of in the way. As we said, disease wipes out probably, and it's only a guess that we make. We don't have an actual census, but we make a guess, about 90% of the native population. Okay, as we zip a bit more through this, a number of factors influence colonial economic development, social structures, and labor systems, causing variation by regions. Students will examine the geographic factors on patterns of settlement and development of colonial economic systems. Okay, first thing to know, English colonies are always by the coast. They center around ports and rivers. Why? Because that's your way to get product out to back home to England, to get supplies into your colonies. So you're looking for good little ports and harbors. You're looking for rivers that, are sort of your highways into the country. and you're sticking more or less near the coasts. What to know about the English colonies? Very important. There are 3 regions. Know them. New England. Villages. Think villages and democracy in New England. New England, the soil was rocky, the winters were long, the growing season short. But there were a lot of good little harbors. You may know Boston, but if you've ever been up along the Connecticut coast, for instance, there's a lot of small little harbors and bays there. Farms, because the soil is rocky and the winters are long, tend to be small family farms. You couldn't really grow large cash crops in New England. So you grew enough to feed your family, and that you were happy with that. Your cash crops of New England were fish, particularly cod, which could be caught, dried, and salted and shipped back to England. That was the big moneymaker. And lumber. New England is full of forests, and the forests have a lot of hardwood trees up there, oaks and maples and things like that, which are very useful for the British, who are building a lot of ships. I point out, eventually slavery would come to New England. We'll talk about slavery in a bit. But most families didn't need or couldn't afford many, if any, slaves. And they also worked side by side with their slaves. Not because they were nice folks or anything like that, but if you had a small family farm, you probably couldn't afford a slave. If you did have a slave as a farmhand, you had 1 or 2 or 3. And it's small enough, you've got to work too. So you're all working together. That's a very different picture from how it was in the South, as we'll see. Because the farms were small, they tended to cluster into what became villages. And when you've got a little village, cluster of farms around it, the people in the village cooperated to build a local church. They used the church on weekdays as a school to teach children to read, particularly that Bible, and some arithmetic. As a result, New England had a very high literacy rate. The number of people in New England who could read and write was probably about double what it was back home in England itself. We think the literacy rate in New England was something about ballpark 70%, which was enormous compared to back home in England. Eventually, almost all the colonial colleges, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth is ringing bells, the Princeton, the Ivy League schools were all up in the Northeast. Well, all of this led to a sort of economic, I say, semi-equality. You still had rich people, you still had poor people, but you had a very large middle class, and the rich were not fabulously wealthy compared to the poor. They were well-to-do, but the gap, the income gap as we call it sometimes, was not nearly as wide. Well, who cares? That economic equality led to a sort of political equality. All the men who, the adult men who owned farms in town, in the village, expected a say in the village government, and chose some of their own friends and fellow farmers to go to the Colonial Assembly, for all of Massachusetts, for instance, to speak on their behalf on larger matters. So they kind of got used to this democratic system. New England is not very diverse. The vast majority of people there spoke the same language, let's say of the same language, English, same background, they were British, and the same religion, some version of Puritanism. Okay. Second group, the middle colonies, and we'll do a map of this in just a minute. When you hear middle colonies, think diversity. The farms in the middle colonies, that is, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the farms were somewhat larger in land area. So in New England, you had a few acres, but in Pennsylvania, you might have a couple of dozen acres. Okay, but it was largely grain farming. So when you're growing wheat, for instance, it doesn't take that many more people for a larger piece of property. You just go out there, and the way you harvest and the way you manage it, you don't need that many people. You can run a larger farm with just a family. Again, slavery was present. But if a family had slaves at all, and not all of them did, it was a couple to a small handful. Villages grow up in the middle colonies, as do some towns, some cities, Philadelphia, New York. And you had a diversity of cash crops. Grain, iron. There's iron deposits here on Staten Island. Toad Hill had iron mines on it. Fish here too, lumber, etc. The big thing is the diversity of people here. If you look at New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, you had people here in this area, even on Staten Island or what's now New York City, alone, who spoke English, Dutch, German, Swedish, Scots Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, a few even Spanish people kicking around. They were of different backgrounds. They came from England and Ireland and Scotland, and Sweden and the Netherlands, and Switzerland, and what is now the Czech Republic, which at the time was Bohemia, and southern Germany. And they were different religions. They weren't just all Puritans, they were Anglicans, which is English, but a different flavor of Protestantism. Lutherans, Presbyterians, which are Scottish Calvinists. I should say Mennonites here too, and put this in, which is the Amish are a flavor of Mennonites. So the Amish are really Swiss, German-speaking Swiss that settle in Pennsylvania. Dutch Calvinists, we have the Dutch here on Staten Island. French, I should put that in there too. The Huguenots. Left that out. Therefore French, right? So, for instance, right here on Staten Island, just to give you an idea, we had people who spoke Dutch, people who spoke French, people who spoke English. You had Dutch Calvinists, French Huguenots, which are French Calvinists, and English Anglicans. You even had a couple of stray kind of Irish Catholics living here by the American Revolution. In Pennsylvania and in New York, in Queens, New York, you had Quakers. There was even a small Jewish community in New York. The gents I taught should remember that. They came when the Dutch were settling here. And later a small community of Jewish folks in Philadelphia. So the middle colonies, the word to know for that is always diversity. Diversity in its economics, in its cash crops, in its religions, in its languages, in its ethnic backgrounds. When you hear the word southern colonies, you should think immediately of tobacco. They didn't find any gold in Virginia, but they found tobacco, sort of brown gold, as they thought of it. Big, big cash crop, and they grew it in Virginia and the Carolinas. The soil in the South was rich, capable of supporting a very demanding crop. Tobacco really eats up the soil. The very wealthy owned vast lands, and so they controlled the economy and politics, but they expected a say for themselves. So, as opposed to New England, where everybody in the village was, you had rich guys and poor guys, but they were sort of more or less similar in economic outlook. They were kind of big middle class. Not so in Virginia. You had super wealthy, giant landowners and the super poor out in the outback, and that was it. The wealthy controlled the politics as well as the economy. There was also not much diversity in southern colonies. Just about everybody in the South, there's some exceptions, were English Anglicans. But they had a large number of slaves for the plantations, often hundreds, to work the tobacco crop. Tobacco has to be harvested by hand. You can't just go in and cut down a field. You have to go plant to plant and rip off each individual leaf when that leaf is ripe. The leaves then have to be processed. They have to be dried and all of this. The soil has to be constantly tended for weeds. So it took a lot of manpower, and therefore these big plantations. In New England, as I said, if you had a slave at all, you had 2, 3. In Virginia, you had 200, 300. Also point out, in the South, they grew rice and indigo. You should remember that. Indigo is the plant that you use to dye things blue. The blue jeans originally were dyed with indigo. So students will examine the factors influencing variations in colonial social structures and labor systems. Well, we just talked about that. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. Let me just remind you, let me show you the map again. So first of all, and I should open this up a bit, I guess, right? Hang on. So this is a look at English settlements. This is not a political map of the lines of the colonies, but this shows you where English people were living by the time you get to the late 1600s, around 1700, right? And you see, what are they doing? Hugging the coasts, hugging the rivers here as we go, the ports, yeah? English settlements, they're thickest right by the coasts, and claimed but not entirely settled. So they're starting to move out into these areas right off of it. Okay, now I point out to you, so this is a map of the colonies. You've got the New England colonies up here. That's Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. There is no Vermont yet. It hasn't been separated. And Maine doesn't exist as a separate state. It's really part of Massachusetts. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. The southern colonies, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. Virginia is really part of the southern colonies, as is Maryland. Oh, Delaware is usually considered, by the way, middle colony. Sometimes we make it a little bit separate because Chesapeake Bay, Maryland and Virginia hug it. But really you can think of all of this as being very, very similar. It's all about big cash crops, particularly tobacco. Okay. Let's talk about slavery and like that. So, indentured servitude versus slavery, increased concentration of slaves in the South. When the colonies in the South get started, they begin to depend on indentured servants. Indentured servants are people who sign a contract, yeah? And I'll just pull this in a bit here. They promise to give over their service for a period of years in return for the plantation owner bringing them to the New World for a chance, eventually, to start their own life here. So you were a young guy in England, you didn't have a job, you were probably dirt poor and living on the streets. So one of these colonists in Virginia would say, all right, tell you what, if I will pay for you, I will pay for your ship passage, your ticket, to go to America. You promise to work for me for like 7 years, without question. And at the end of 7 years, you can then settle in America yourself and have your own farm and, how high is up in America? You can find in the American colonies a place to be prosperous. So a lot of these very poor people did this. Indentured servants were pretty desperate, pretty poor, and not well treated. Most found that conditions were pretty hard, and once they were freed at the end of their contract, the only land available to them was scrubby, bad land out at the edge of the colonies, fighting Indians. Now I should point out here, and I will throw this in, plantation owners who paid for indentured servants to come got a reward of land, the headright system, it was called. So if you paid to bring over colonists, even if they were indentured servants, you not only had the guy who was your indentured servant, but now the colony would give you some free land as a reward for helping get the place settled. That meant that the rich got richer and landowners got to own more and more land. And if land is the source of wealth and power, the rich guys who could afford to bring over indentured servants get even more land, get even more powerful, and pretty soon you have a handful of hyper super wealthy running the whole show in a place like Virginia or the Carolinas. Well, the indentured servant thing kind of wears out. England starts to get more prosperous thanks to its colonies. And as we say in the business, a rising tide raises all boats. So as England gets more prosperous, the average person becomes more prosperous as well. Whoops. So there are fewer desperately poor people, willing to put up with being indentured servants. Ironically, as the colonies prospered, fewer and fewer people wanted to go over there as indentured servants because who wants to put up with that? And you know, I'm doing okay at home in London now. Well, the problem is, tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. It needs careful tending and harvesting by hand. So what do you do for labor? Portuguese traders first show up actually by accident in Virginia in 1619, carrying a cargo of slaves. Once the British start to think about, maybe we could do this, it becomes the new normal, and English colonies begin to import African slaves to do their work. I'm just realizing now this is a little fuzzy, but this is good enough for us for the moment. This is the so-called Middle Passage, or the triangular trade. Slaves come from Africa. They are imported by Portuguese and English traders. They bring them to the Caribbean and to North America. They're sold as slaves. The Americans ship over sugar cane and rum, which is made from molasses, which is made from sugar cane, to England. England ships rum and other objects, Bibles and things, down to Africa to trade for slaves. So that's the so-called triangular trade. It is also referred to as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is all of that trade of Africans to the Americas, South America, Caribbean, and North America, out of the west side of Africa. And we see the millions of people. Out of this part of Africa alone, you have about 5.6 million people. If you look at it, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you're talking about 15 million people, human beings, moved from Africa heavily to what's now Brazil, largely to the Caribbean to work on the sugar plantations, but 2, 3, 400,000 moved to the American colonies to work there. And the conditions were horrific. This is how a slave ship was laid out. So you had a top deck. This is where the top of the deck's there. And this is the deck below the top. And this is how they were lined up. They figured out how to get the maximum number of human beings, pack them in, chain them in place. Chain them in place without being able to move for about 6 weeks, 6 or 7 weeks to make the voyage across. So they would throw down occasionally a little food and a little water. They didn't get to move, which meant they did not get to use the restroom. And this is the conditions these people were in. And if some of them died along the way, you just threw them over the side and took it as part of, the cost of doing business. Okay. Plantations become larger. They become more and more dependent on slavery. So the bigger you are, the more workers you need, and you cannot get by without them. Slavery spreads to other areas, I pointed out, but by 1790, about half of Staten Island families, there were only a few thousand people living here, owned slaves, and slaves altogether were about a quarter of the population on Staten Island. They're not going to ask you about Staten Island on the exam, but I just use it as an example, a typical county, even up here in the north. New England and middle colonies were never dependent on slavery the way the southern colonies were, and over time slavery would eventually fade here. And in Pennsylvania, they kept trying to abolish it. The Quakers founded Pennsylvania, and you had a big Quaker population there. They believe, Quakers, that all human beings contain, quote, the inner light of God. Therefore, they kept trying to abolish slavery in Pennsylvania. They were only ever partially successful. The Quakers, I should also point out, traded with the Indians as equals, as opposed to other British colonies in Pennsylvania. When they wanted more land, they bought it from the Indians, and they were required to pay, a fair market price. In the South, once slavery became so important to the economic system, slave owners had to start inventing justifications. Why do I have this human being in chains? I look at it, I go to church on Sunday and Jesus talks about salvation, and then I go home and I've got this black guy on my plantation who's being beaten up. So they have to justify it to themselves. They have to rationalize it. And they begin to develop racial theories. Africans, they have to convince themselves, are little more than animals and beasts. So we white people, I should make that clear, are doing them a favor, they convince themselves, by putting them to productive work and managing them. That's going to be unclear to you. So, and I want to make this clear, the whites have to convince themselves. So, they have to start inventing this whole idea that there's a hierarchy among races. I just point out to you, I pointed out to classes I've taught. If you look at the ancient world, you guys did a bit in global, they had slavery in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. You became a slave in those cultures because you owed money or you were conquered in war. So when the Romans would invade some place, they'd conquer some joint, they'd take a bunch of guys as slaves just to prove that they were top dog. If you owed a lot of money, you could sell yourself into slavery or you might be sentenced to slavery. It had nothing to do with your race. A Roman might own a black African as a slave, but an Ethiopian royal official might own a white German barbarian as a slave too. Race didn't really come into it. In America, we have to develop this idea that some races are better than others, that some are more animalistic, in order to justify importing, as we said, millions of people from Africa simply to work on the plantations. And the more there are of these slaves, and the more you depend on it, and you have to stop even thinking about freeing them, the more you have to justify it to yourself. They also have to make harsher and harsher slave codes. Why? Because you now have a handful of people in a family living on a plantation surrounded by 500 slaves. If they ever rise up in rebellion, you're cooked. And so their solution to that, quotes, is to oppress the slaves even more. And the slave codes become harsher and harsher and harsher. Okay, let's talk about politics for a bit. Colonial political developments were influenced by British political traditions, Enlightenment ideas, and the colonial experience. Self-governing structures were common, yet varied across the colonies. Let's talk a little bit about the background. Never forget, all of these guys are somehow part of the British Empire, and they follow then in the British legal tradition. One thing that was built into British consciousness was Magna Carta, which is simply Latin for Great Charter. So in 1215 AD, the nobility of Britain, the barons of Britain, the lords of Britain, backed King John, who was something of a jerk, into a corner at a place called Runnymede. Not really into a corner, because Runnymede is a big meadow, but and forced him to accept Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Summary here. Magna Carta says, the king is not above the law. Even the king has to follow the law. Law is not the king's whim or mood. The king has to rule justly and follow the law himself. The nobility, which meant the landowners, have a right to a say in that. The king cannot tax them without their consent, and he must call them together in Parliament to make law. This is the beginnings of the idea of government by consent of the governed. Let me point out, though, the only people who had a say were the big landowners, meaning the nobility. But it's a beginning. It also says that people, all people, have a right to a fair judgment in a fair trial. The king cannot use the courts simply to take revenge against his enemies. Everyone has a right to have a fair group of citizens, a jury, vote on their guilt or innocence. To be fair, that jury must be made up of peers. So the nobility is judged by other nobles, and common people are judged by other commoners. Common people shouldn't be on trial in front of nobility, who have a reason to kind of screw them, and the nobility shouldn't have to go on trial in front of commoners, who might be trying to get back at them. And so there's kind of a fair system of courts. Well, all of these English settlers, that was built into their DNA, this Magna Carta idea. That was already in the back of their heads. Now along comes the Enlightenment. John Locke. And late 1600s, you can go look up his dates, you're not going to need them for the exam, but John Locke comes up with new ideas about government. They're built on ideas that already existed. John Locke doesn't come out of no place. But he writes in his famous 2 treatises on government, all men are created by the Creator, not by the government, as equal. So we are all equal, not because the government says so, but because it's built into our humanity, given to us by God, however you conceive of God. Each person is therefore endowed by the Creator, not by the government, with an equal right to life, to liberty, and to property. Now, understand what he means by property. He's not talking about everybody gets a piece of land. He's saying value, wealth, is what you make of the things around you. A lump of iron is just a lump of iron. But if you take your hands and you turn it into steel and make a tool out of it, you have given that iron value. You've done it with your labor. You have a right to the value now of that tool that you have created from a lump of nothing. That's what he means by property. So because everybody is equal, each person is entitled to their own life, given to them by God, their ability to use their mind to act and to think, and to enjoy the value of what they create, the labor of their own hands. Governments are there, says Locke, to make sure your use of liberty does not get in the way of my use of liberty. Your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose. So you got a right to swing your arm if you want. But I also have a right not to be hit in the face. Government is there to make sure that you maximize your right to swing your arm without it interfering with my right not to be hit in the face. And sometimes you got to make some rules about that. And government exists by the consent of the governed. We create government in order to accomplish these things by all of us equally consenting to its existence. John Locke is the great philosopher. We put him in the back of our head. If it sounds familiar, Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, lifts the famous sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it." Jefferson takes that sentence almost word for word out of John Locke. They also say, the regents say, you should know not just Magna Carta and Enlightenment, but the colonial experience. Colonists had no way to keep checking with government back in England, so they had to figure out how to manage themselves. They create local assemblies, the New York Assembly, the Virginia House of Burgesses, New England town meetings, to do this. Because they can't, they arrive in the New World, they're part of England, but it takes at least 6 weeks to get back to England by boat and another 6 weeks for a message to get back to America. So at minimum, if you have a problem here in, say, Plymouth Colony, if you have to keep checking back home, at minimum, it's a 3-month turnaround time. Plus. So they start to take it upon themselves, we've got to organize stuff here. How do we do that? And they start to come up with systems. In New England, they have that village town meeting. In New York, they start to have this colonial assembly where they elect representatives from the counties. In Virginia, the big landowners in each county elect representatives to the Virginia House of Burgesses. One had to be a white adult male to participate, and usually a property owner. You had to either own land or you had to own a business in order to be allowed to vote. It was assumed that property owners had a bigger stake in the economy, and so should have a bigger say. They were more likely to be the ones paying taxes. And that those mature, hard-working, those who are mature, hard-working, and smart enough to own some property or wealth are wise and intelligent enough to at least help make good decisions. So the idea was, if you were poor, you probably were irresponsible, you probably weren't smart enough or sharp enough to be helpful. If you were wealthy, well, you probably had wealth or at least kept your wealth because you were smart enough to make some good decisions. And after all, you had a bigger stake in the economy. Therefore, you got to vote. Some specifics here. The Mayflower Compact, know it. The Plymouth colonists on the Mayflower ship come over from New England. They're halfway across for the very first settlement in New England, and it occurs to them, how are we going to organize this? So while they're on the ship, they write up this document. A compact is a kind of contract. All the heads of the households, these were families mostly, sign this thing. They all agree that all of them will have a say, a vote in organizing life in the new colony. So all of the heads of the families will get to have a say in what rules they make. But once those rules are made, they all agree to abide by those decisions whether they like it or not. So if you vote on something and the majority of people vote yes and you voted no, you are committing yourself to go along with the rule anyway. Otherwise, we just have a chaotic system. Mayflower Compact, you should know, is the first real attempt at self-government in the colonies, and an example of a sort of representative democracy. New England town meetings, we've already talked about. As those villages grow up in New England, that tradition from the Mayflower Compact kind of continues. All the heads of family families, I guess I should put, who were landowners in town meet together to make rules for the town, to tax themselves and cooperate in things like building a town church and a schoolhouse. So it kind of follows on from that. Virginia House of Burgesses is also an early representative democracy. Landowners in each county elect a fellow landowner to speak for them in the Virginia Colonial Legislature, which is what the House of Burgesses was. But you had to be a landowner, the wealthier class, to have a say. Leftover idea from British aristocracy, the nobility, right? New Netherlands had a thing called the right of petition. Dutch settlers could go over the local governor's head and appeal to the Dutch government to fix problems or rein in bad government. So they didn't exactly get a vote, but they did get the opportunity, if the governor was screwing up, to ask for the higher government to step in and take a look. The Maryland Act of Toleration, you should know, is an early attempt at freedom of religion. Maryland was started by an English Catholic nobleman, an English Catholic noble family, to be a business. Always colonies are businesses. But it was also, as a side effect, a place where Catholic colonists would be left in peace, having been persecuted in England. It was still part of the British Empire, which was officially Protestant, so Maryland could not be a Catholic colony. You couldn't call it that. So instead, the closest they could come was to give toleration, freedom of religion, to any Christian who settled there. And what they really meant were Catholics. This was pretty short-lived, though, as the colony eventually was taken over by the king himself and became, again, officially Protestant. But it was a moment, and began to put the idea of religious toleration into the heads of colonists. So let's put that in. The idea of religious toleration into the heads of colonists. I also point out, they didn't mention it, in New York we had a similar thing. In the 1680s, the king appointed his best friend, this is true, Thomas Dongan, who was an Irish Catholic nobleman, as governor. Dongan tried to do the same. He created a thing called the Charter of Liberties and Privileges. Freedom of religion, sort of. Freedom of speech, to a degree. Colonial elected assembly. So what is he doing? Dongan creates this Charter of Liberties and Privileges and gives freedom of religion to Christians, by which he meant Catholics, because he couldn't just make it a Catholic colony. A limited freedom of speech. Full-on freedom of speech would have been not really what they thought of in those days, but something. And an elected colonial assembly, which had some influence on the governor. But this too was short-lived. And New York reverted to being a crown colony, officially Protestant. So, I have fat fingers when I type. So, they tried it. And again, it puts the idea in colonists' head, even though it's short-lived. I just point out, for no particular reason, Dongan also was given as his pay the northern half, more or less, of Staten Island, and builds a little a hunting lodge here, down, if you know the North Shore, right near the intersection of Dungan Street, named for him, and Richmond Terrace. If you know where the Manor Road Post Office is on Victory Boulevard, just down the street on Manor Road, which is an ancient trail that ran through his manor, there's a small white house there that actually goes back to Dungan's day. A part of the house goes back to that. And Castleton Avenue, which runs the other way, Manor Road runs roughly north-south, Castleton Avenue runs roughly east-west, cuts through the manor in that direction, east-west, and the whole thing was called the Manor of Castleton after his hometown back in Ireland. That's a minor bit of trivia. Okay, we'll leave it there and pick up with the next section next. From 1215 AD.